All right, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. We have with us Courtney McNeil from the Telfair Museum, and I'm going to let Catherine Renner, who is also here from the Telfair, give you her introduction. Catherine has joined us once before for one of our other lectures. She is part of the development team at Telfair Museums, and she has been there for just over 10 years. She is the director of annual giving and is a liaison for museum patrons who support Telfair through an annual giving fund and membership level called the Director's Circle. So we are very glad to have her here, just telling us a little bit more about the Telfair and how you can get involved. And then she's going to introduce us all to Courtney, and we will go from there. So Catherine, with that said, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. We're extremely grateful to have this opportunity again to present to such a lovely group of Meadow Bluff residents. And we are grateful to you too, Nicole, for approaching Courtney to set this up. It's a great way for us to share the museum. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope that some of you were able to join us for one or both of the previous talks. But for those of you who are joining maybe for the first time today, there are a couple of things about Telfair and its history that bear repeating because it's such a rich and wonderful history, one that we can all take great pride in. I'm going to share my screen here for just a moment. And here we are. So Telfair is the oldest public art museum in the South and the first art museum founded by a woman. And formerly the Telfair family mansion, the museum opened its doors to the public as an art museum in 1886. Through the bequest of Mary Telfair. And this created the foundation for art education and cultural education in the region. To give context to this, Telfair was founded just 16 years after the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Boston Fine Arts Museum. So that's a pretty interesting fact, I think. Both of those were founded in 1870. So today, our museum is comprised of these three buildings representing art, history, and architecture. We have Telfair Academy on the left and the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters in the middle, and the Jepson Center on the far right. And we have so much to share, but the best way for us to do that is probably to have you become a member if you're so inclined. We'd love to have you join the Telfair family. We couldn't be more exciting, or it couldn't be a more exciting time to join the museum than right now, because we are about to welcome Ben Simons as our new CEO and Executive Director. Ben is coming on board in early January, and since 2016, he's been the executive director of the Academy Art Museum in Easton, Maryland. And before that, he worked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and for more than a decade at the Nantucket Historical Association. And Ben has degrees from Harvard, Yale, and the University of London's Courtauld Institute of Art. So he's got wonderful credentials, and we are over the moon excited to welcome him and his wife, Allison Cooley, who is herself an artist, and their son, Finley. So we'll be welcoming them to the Telfair and to the Savannah community. So if you are a member already, thank you. But if not, we have many affordable basic memberships levels, of which and all include unlimited access to the museums, all three sites. Through December, we have a special partnership with Second Harvest, and a portion of those renewing and joining the Telfair up to a certain level, part of that will go to purchase food for their, to restock the food pantry for Savannah area. We also have contributing levels of membership, and for just a bit more, and they include reciprocal memberships to over 1,000 museums across the country. And we finally have what Nicole referenced earlier, and that's the Director Circle member. We have, and this is an example of a lecture that we had in the Telfair Academy, and dinner afterwards at one of the local venues. This group represents our most generous donors and strongest advocates, and they really help make it possible to pursue our mission to present art for all through educational programming, community outreach, exhibitions, and the care of our collections. So I cordially invite you to, here we have an example of one of our activities with Director Circle, a behind the scenes uncrating of a Rodin sculpture. And we planned our free Saturday family activities around that exhibition. The children, the entire fourth grade in Chatham County made sculptures of their hands that you can see on the far left, and all kinds of activities to make that exhibition come to life for the students and the families. And finally, here's some information. If you have any questions at all, I invite you to contact me, and I'd be happy to share more information about any of the levels of membership and Director Circle. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, my esteemed colleague, Courtney McNeil. Courtney is Telfair's Deputy Director and Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at Telfair, where she has been for 15 years, the past 15 years, overseeing the creation of museums' first scope of collections and collections plans, and has curated many noteworthy exhibitions at Telfair, many of which have been recognized both regionally and nationally, including the National Endowment for the Arts and the Terra Foundation of American Art. Sadly, Courtney will be leaving Telfair in mid-January, but the fantastic news is that she's going to be joining the Baker Museum in Naples, Florida, and which is a wonderful and well-deserved opportunity for Courtney. And I'll probably stop there because I don't want to start crying, and I'll just turn it over to Courtney for her great presentation now.
Thank you, Catherine, for that incredibly kind introduction. You know, I've been here 15 years, but Catherine's been here 10, so we've worked together for a decade, and it's people like you, Catherine, that have made that time such a pleasure. So thank you so much. Thank you to Nicole for having us today, and thank you to all of you for tuning in, taking time out of your afternoon to sit and hear about some art. I think that Catherine makes a compelling pitch for being involved in the museum, but hearing her talk about Director Circle, I'm reminded of just what a fun and convivial group that is, where I feel that it would be worth joining, even if you don't like art, just for the quality of the people who are a part of it. And they're another part of my experience at this museum that have made it so valuable and so exciting to me. Just wonderful people from all over the world who've made their way to Savannah, and it's a wonderful group of supporters. So thank you for coming out today. I'm going to start my screen share with my PowerPoint. Because today I'm going to be talking about images of Savannah from the first part of the 20th century. Now, some of this ties back to the history of Telfair Museum, so I'm glad that Catherine spoke to that briefly in her introduction. And this story of art in Savannah really cannot be told without telling the story of Telfair Museums. The organization, as Catherine mentioned, was founded in 1875, opened in 1886 as one of the first museums in the whole country. And originally it was not founded as a museum about Savannah. It was a museum for Savannah, bringing the best of the art world, both nationally and internationally, to this small city in Georgia. And it really wasn't until the 20th century, well into the 20th century, that the museum started engaging with art and artists of Savannah. But once they did, it went on to become a really important symbiotic relationship, and one that I think still continues in a certain way up to the present day. So the idea of what constituted museum quality art in the late 19th century was very much grounded in this idea of the European academies and the salons. A lot of importance was placed on narrative history painting, on very highly detailed, incredibly lifelike styles of painting that were part of this very long academic tradition in cities like Paris and other cities throughout Europe. And it wasn't until a new wave of artists began working in both France and other countries around the world, and working in more avant-garde progressive styles, that this mode really shifted. So it was in the late 1900s that the Impressionist artists first started working in Paris. And that was a movement that made its way all over the world and eventually to Savannah as well. And for us, the story of art making in Savannah really reached a crucial point in 1920. So when the museum was founded, Telfair opened in 1886. It looks very much as it looks on this screen here. We had the plaster cast hall in the basement of the Telfair Academy, and then the rotunda gallery above it, where you can see the paintings were hung frame to frame in this salon style hang that really closely attempted to replicate the look of a great salon in Paris or elsewhere. But then in 1920, something shifted. So the governance of Telfair had been through the Georgia Historical Society, but Telfair had existed on its own for long enough that the GHS felt that it could operate independently. And so in order to allow Telfair to go out and spread its wings and do different things, the GHS resigned its trust and Telfair became independent in 1920. That same year, the Telfair partnered closely with the Savannah Art Club to help foster that organization along. So Telfair became independent, Savannah Art Club was founded, and this fledgling art movement in Savannah really started to find its footing. The Savannah Art Club was founded to develop art appreciation in individuals and to further art as a part of the cultural life of the community, according to their original mission statement. And this was part of a broader movement that was happening in the early 20th century in the South. The South had lagged economically after the Civil War and the fallout from that event. And it started to find its footing in the 1920s as you had things like the Charleston Renaissance happening, and there was a great burgeoning of the visual arts and literature and other artistic forms all around the same time. And Savannah's artistic movement was around the same time as that. So today I'm going to be looking at what resulted from all of these changes and these circumstances that were happening in the early 20th century, and what resulted from that, which was Telfair's new mandate to encourage art education and practicing artists, the founding of the Savannah Art Club, and then this broader cultural renaissance in the South that began after World War I down here in Savannah. And I'll be doing this through the lens of works of art from Telfair's own collection. So one thing I want to point out as we get going is that Telfair's focus, as I mentioned before, was very heavily European in its founding era. And in fact, we did not actively collect Savannah art until the very end of the 20th century. So when you look, museum insider tips, the very last line here is the credit line for a work saying who gave the work or who made the purchase possible. And then this number at the end is the accession number. And it consists of the year the painting or the work of art was acquired by the museum. And then the numbers after are, which work of art it was that year that it was acquired. So this was the 18th group of works to be acquired in 2007. And as we go through, you'll notice that most of these accession numbers are fairly late in the 20th century. And it shows how the museum really took a while to catch up to the idea that work by Savannah artists was worth collecting and exhibiting alongside, the greats from Europe and New York that we had traditionally exhibited. The work here that you see is really near and dear to my heart because it's by Mary Comer Lane. who was one of the founding members of the Savannah Art Club, and who also was friends with Margaret Thomas, who is the last woman to live in what is now the Owens Thomas House. And she bequeathed that home to Telfair Museums to convert it into an art museum. So here we have this really intimate view of the back porch of the Owens Thomas House when it was still a private residence, painted by one of the founding Savannah Art Club members, Mary Comer Lane. Lane was also trained. She came up through this lineage in Savannah of Savannah artists and instructors. She studied under a woman named Emma Wilkins, who we'll see more of her work later. And she also had the privilege of being able to afford to travel in the summers and take summer classes in places like Gloucester, Massachusetts, which has been a thriving artist colony for many generations. So here we can see Lila Cabanis and Hattie Saucy, and I paired these two works together because they're so similar. You can imagine that we have a lot of this combination in the collection. These are two of my favorites. We have live oaks, we have Spanish moss, and we have azaleas, and even palms, I believe, in both of these paintings. So it's kind of the big four of the Savannah landscape, showing those iconic images. But here you can see how these two women artists working in the early 20th century approached this subject with such love and care for their hometowns. Lila Cabanis was another of the founders of the Savannah Art Club, and she's also really well known for her work as an educator. She instituted the first art curriculum in the Savannah public school system in 1915, and she began a field trip program for public school students to come to the Telfair Academy around that same time. So since the very early 20th century, Telfair has had a strong focus on education. And this continues to the present day, where we bring in every fourth grader in Chatham County to the museum every year to see an exhibition and do a hands-on art making activity as well. These trips are obviously happening virtually this year and hopefully this year only. But I've been really thrilled at how our education department has been able to pivot and adapt and utilize technology to continue to bring this important experience to our students that was first begun around 1915 by Lila Cabanis. On the right, we have Hattie Saucy, who was another one of those artists who trained in Savannah, but also had the good fortune to train and study in New York. She went over to Paris and very famously had to quickly and hastily relocate back to the United States because she was in Paris as World War I was breaking out. And so she returned to the States. She lived primarily in Savannah and then dedicated her life to her painting and doing scenes like this. So another intriguing thing about Savannah that rang true in the early 20th century and is still true today is that it's very easy to get visitors, especially people from the north who might be suffering through colder weather, to come down and visit our beautiful part of the country, especially in the winter months. So here we see a painting by Elliot Clark, who was a premier artist in New York in the early 20th century. And he was one of the first visiting art instructors who the Savannah Art Club brought in to do a winter residency, teach some classes. And of course, he painted some Savannah subjects while he was here, including this fantastic nocturne that's incredibly tonalistic in that he does not feature bright areas of contrasting color, but it's rather a tone-on-tone application of these blues and greens and grays. In the background, you have these fabulous lights and the plumes of smoke that are just visible in the distance. And it really has an almost Whistlerian feel to it. It's a really remarkable canvas to see in person. I should add that most of these works are currently on view at the museum. Upstairs at the Telfair Academy building, we have a whole gallery dedicated to Savannah scenes where most of these works are on view right now. Elliot Clark also took a more industrial approach to some of his work, and here he's showing the smoke plumes of Savannah in the industrial part of town that was down by River Street. You know, obviously this is now a tourist hub in Savannah, and so it's interesting reflecting on downtown Savannah's industrial past in this period of 1924 to 25. And so a particular favorite of mine among these artists active in Savannah in the early 20th century is this gentleman here, Christopher A.D. Murphy, sometimes known as Christopher Murphy Jr. He was from an incredibly artistic family. Both of his parents were artists. His sister was an artist as well and an art educator. And he himself was able to, he graduated from Benedictine Military School in Savannah at the age of 18, and within days was on a train up to New York, where he studied at the Art Students League, attended lectures by Robert Henry and other iconic artists of the time. And because his parents were both artists, he sent these, rapturous letters back home talking about the New York art scene and everything he was experiencing there. So Murphy is one of the most highly trained of these artists who are working in Savannah, because he spent several years in New York until the great economic collapse of the 1920s and the Great Depression forced him to return home. So he came home to help his family's business. His father had a commercial painting business and sign painting business. And so he helped out with his family's business. And then he also worked as an artist until really the end of his long life. He didn't pass away until 1973. And his work, it has this wonderful, really local feel to it. In this particular painting specifically, you can look at those figures and see that kind of cartoonish aspect that they almost have to them, these kind of exaggerated limbs and things. And it really brings to mind work by some of the American scene painters or regionalist painters like Thomas Hart Benton or even Grant Wood. But I really feel like Christopher Murphy Jr. is Thomas Hart Benton in Savannah. The figures are really drawn with love and with care, but they have that sort of exaggerated feel to them. And Murphy was enamored of his hometown of Savannah. So he did paintings like the one we just saw. He did these really rapid sketches that we see here. He also was an etcher. And this was something that, an artist who's just dabbling in art making, a Sunday afternoon painter, for example, is not going to just dabble in etching, because it's a really demanding medium, requires a lot of training, dangerous chemicals, and a lot of scientific and practical knowledge to be able to execute it successfully. So he was distinguished in that regard. And he actually studied printmaking with Joseph Pennell in New York. And if you're familiar with Pennell at all, he's best known as being the biographer of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, but was a fantastic printmaker in his own right. Then you'll see these little sketchy figures in Murphy's drawings and prints really echo Pennell's work as well. So this is under the Cotton Exchange right down on Bay Street in Savannah. These two prints here by Christopher Murphy show some of the trademarks of his architectural etchings, which is usually a smaller scale. You can see the one of the back of the OT house here is only less than 4 by 4 inches. This one's 6 by 6 inches. And he combines this interest in architecture of his hometown, architecture of all kinds, from the most stately mansions to the most humble homes. But one thing he never fails to include is the human figure. So these streets and these houses and these architectural spaces are not a home until they're populated, and they don't have scale or warmth until there are people activating them. So in this image here, you see, looks like a child with a hoop, a person walking. And in this image over here, you see folks just going about their daily business. Looks like 2 kids playing, a woman descending from her stairs, a man driving the wagon. And really think about these prints, how they would appear if they didn't have those figures, and how kind of cold they would seem. And it really shows you that Murphy knew what he was doing in warming up these scenes by including the figures. This view of the Savannah River is another favorite as well. He lends this really pink hue to the water. And here we're looking at another medium that he was really talented at, and that is pastel on paper. So he really did it all, and in my opinion is the most talented of the professionally trained artists to come out of Savannah in the early 20th century, which is why I included so many of his works in this talk. So Murphy was a close contemporary of folks like Elizabeth O'Neill Verner, who is a Charleston Renaissance artist, and is really well known for her association with that city's cultural revival. But she, like Murphy, is known for depicting these, modest scenes of architecture and everyday life in her hometown. But she also traveled to Savannah as well and did a nice group of etchings based on her time here. So we have several of those on view at the museum as well, and have several of them in our collection. Here we can see the Harbor Light in Savannah, which was put up in 1858 as a navigational beacon for folks on the river. It stands 77 feet above river level and was intended to guide the ships approaching the harbor. was restored more recently in 2001, so it's still there. Moving ahead a little bit chronologically, we're now in 1941 with this work by Mark Sheridan. This is an example of a Georgia artist. Sheridan was a Georgia artist who was active in one of the many regional art groups and contemporary art groups that the Telfair exhibited and supported back in the day. So this is that rare exception to the rule I mentioned before. You can see this work we purchased directly from the artist in 1941. It's a rare example of us collecting a contemporary Savannah artist during that artist's lifetime. But like the Elliot Clarks we looked at earlier, we have this rendering of Savannah as in a nocturnal setting and with a real industrial feel to it as you look at these industrial buildings off in the distance. Yet somehow the composition is really harmonious and beautiful despite the industrial subject matter. And of course, you cannot miss, when you see this in person, the twinkling lights that we get here, 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 here. They really just enliven the canvas and draw your eye all the way around it. So not all of the artists in our collection who worked in Savannah were professionally trained. Some of them were self-taught as well. Anna Hunter on the right is interesting. She was actually a journalist. She was assigned to cover the art scene in Savannah, and because she didn't have much of a background in that area, she decided to take some art classes herself. And she took, so she was not really, she didn't consider herself to be professionally trained because she only took some like children's art classes and deliberately stopped taking classes after a certain point. She felt like she had gotten a little bit of that, but really wanted to develop on her own. So there are folks who call her the Grandma Moses of the South. She painted these really naive but charming scenes, including this one in our collection of River Street in Savannah. And then on the other side of the slide here, we can see a drawing by a man named William O. Golding. And Golding has a fascinating life story. And in fact, he's going to be the subject of a solo exhibition at the museum in 2022, because we just were able to acquire a large group of his drawings for our permanent collection. And we have this one that we've had for several years that shows, again, the riverfront in Savannah. But Golding was a young boy. His father had been a Reconstruction lawmaker. His family was African American. His father was active during Reconstruction. And when Golding was a young boy, he was down on the docks in Savannah when he was kidnapped by a ship's captain and then taken to serve at sea for decades, really. And it wasn't until many, many years later that he returned to Savannah, and he was in a convalescent home for retired sailors that a local Savannah introduced him to art making as a form of therapy, and that's how he began drawing. So he's got these amazing little details to his work, the tiny little figures, and he's drawing all from memory. And this is a Savannah work, but he drew the scenes that he'd seen all over the world as well. And then here we have work by a woman named Helen Hatch Inglesby, who's really beloved in Savannah as the silhouette lady. She was incredibly talented at cutting silhouettes, and she began working in this mode after her father and her grandmother had offered her instruction. So it was a family tradition, and she first started cutting silhouettes, I believe, when she was about 4 years old. But clearly her artistic production was not limited to that. She also made paintings, watercolors, and here we have a charcoal drawing and an ink and wash drawing. And these two images are really special to me because they look at how these landscapes were lived in and used by working people, whether that's a man unloading cargo down on the docks or whether that's an artist sketching at the Wilmington River. So here, if you look at this one, you can see the one figure here, part of a figure here, another over here. So it's a really lovely snippet into how practicing artists banded together, went out on these sketching trips to draw from nature, seeing that influence from the French Impressionists and others who felt that artists needed to get outside and paint what they saw around them in nature. So Alexander Brooke is another one of those artists who had a really strong reputation in New York and was invited down to work as a visiting art instructor and quickly realized that the weather in Savannah in the winter was much more favorable than the weather in New York. So he ended up coming down for several winters in this period of the late 30s and the early 40s. And then near the end of his life, in the 1970s, he donated a large group of his Savannah works to the museum. So this is one of the larger, more substantial works that he donated, although you can see that it's unfinished, right? You've got these figures here who are just kind of drawn out and sketched out without any coloring or finishing on them. Yet the artist considered it finished enough to have signed it and finished enough to have donated it to the museum. So, you know, he certainly seemed to consider it an important enough work to exhibit, and we certainly do. We show this work a lot because it shows not just the architecture of Savannah, but the people that lived here and how they engaged with that architecture. So we believe the building here is the Union Branch Baptist Church, which stood at this time in the neighborhood in Savannah known as Frogtown, out on the west side of the city. Brooke is an interesting guy because he was achieving a lot of recognition for his work during his lifetime, but is much lesser known today. And to give you a sense of just how elevated his reputation was at the time of his life, so here I've got a slide. In 1939, these two paintings were called out as two of the most important art acquisitions by American art museums in the entire year. So very famously on the right, we have Pablo Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, which was painted in 1907, but was acquired by MoMA in 1939. And then on the left, we have a painting that Alexander Brooke painted in 1939 that was acquired by the Carnegie Museums in Pittsburgh. They still own this work as well. And it shows really the level of the recognition that Brooke had gotten during his lifetime, and how there was interest in this Georgia subject matter going much more broadly outside of the region than simply our Savannah audiences here. So Gina Nee was an artist who was a contemporary of Alexander Brooks. She was actually married to him for a time and came to Savannah during her marriage with him. She was going away from the style of representation that Brooke typically worked in, and instead was going into abstraction, but with certain recognizable elements. So this particular work is called Savannah Abstraction, and this was another work that wasn't acquired until many years after it was painted. We bought this in 2004. And she's really best known for her modernist paintings in New Mexico, but she also spent a lot of time here in the South, and this is a nice example of her work that she completed here. Like Brooke, her husband at the time, she became really immersed in the Savannah artistic scene here and befriended many of her fellow local artists like Hattie Saucy, who we saw earlier, among others. So another of our favorite Savannah scenes from the collection is Andre Ruellen's Savannah street scene. This is actually Barnard Street in Savannah, going down to the river on River Street. So the building over here is actually what I believe is still the Chart House restaurant. That building still stands. And the cobblestones look a lot the same, although many, many years have passed since Ruellen painted this. She was not from the South. She was from New York and spent a lot of time in upstate New York and Woodstock, New York, but traveled to Savannah a couple of times and really was taken with the subject matter here and the landscape and the architecture. She was one who would go out and make sketches from life in person and then take the sketches back to her studio and create paintings like this from them. So at 26 by 36, this would not have been painted on scene. It was painted back in her studio from sketches that she made. Interestingly, this habit of sketching sometimes got her in trouble. So when she was on the Savannah waterfront in 1942, drawing some sketches, she and her husband were picked up and questioned by the local police because they were concerned that they might be spying for the Germans, I suppose. There was a US military installation down on the river at the time, and they were highly concerned. Photography at the waterfront was prohibited at that time because of security concerns, and access to the river was restricted. So these two out-of-town artists, nobody quite knew what they were up to. But thankfully, Alexander Brooke, whose work we just saw a couple slides ago, came down to the police station and was able to vouch for them and get them released, thankfully. John Taylor was the husband of Andre Ruellen, and like her, he was long associated with the artist colony at Woodstock, New York. This is a sketch that he created in Savannah, a smaller painting, 14 by 20, of the landscape of Savannah. Again, that sort of bleak industrial landscape that so many artists seem to be drawn to. And here we can see this large gas tank that was really a fixture of the skyline in the eastern part of the city that loomed over what was the remains of Fort Wayne in Savannah. And then here we have Augusta Olshig, who takes a decidedly brighter and more cheerful approach to Savannah scenes in the middle of the 20th century. And this is her painting of the old city market here in Savannah. And not to get off on an architectural tangent, but looking at this, it looks like every Publix that they've built here in the Low Country area, right? This is the city market building that was famously demolished in the 50s, and the preservationists, this burgeoning preservation movement, had fought to try to protect it because it was this hub of activity and commerce and people from all different walks of life. Though they were unsuccessful, this style of architecture really became enshrined here in the South, and you see it being replicated and echoed everywhere up to the present day, really. But this is another artist who was working in a style that really showed the influence of the regionalist painters like Thomas Hart Benton. One of my favorite little scenes is this woman here who's dragging the hand of a clearly very unwilling toddler who I think is kind of bracing himself on that light post so that he can argue with his mother. I have 3 small boys, so this one strikes a little bit too close to home. And the way you've got, this, you have these 2 men chatting over here, the woman with her parasol, you've got animals running through the streets. It just shows you every kind of life and activity possible that was centered on the old city market building at this time. Now, this painting was recently conserved, so I have to point out that when you see it now, it's on view in the galleries, this sky is much cleaner and brighter, and I'm really glad that we were able to have that work done to really better represent the artist's original intention for how it should appear. But Olshig is interesting because she was a Savannah native, and she went off, she was really progressive in the art that she wanted to make, and she was interested in the civil rights movement and social justice and racial inequality, and was incorporating that into the art that she was making here. And it was not received well. The art circles at that time in Savannah were very conservative. They were not political. So she left and went to New York for several years and spread her wings there. She also spent some time in Mexico studying with many of the Mexican modernist painters, and brought some of that influence back, and eventually resettled here in Savannah and lived most of the rest of her long life here. Here we have another Augusta Olshig. This is a smaller study, 16 by 28. She had been painting something nearby this square when there were these kids who were hanging out nearby and getting in the way of the image that she was trying to sketch out. And she finally told them, okay, if you won't move, then I guess I'll paint all of you. Will you be happy then? And they said, yes, sure. So they posed for her, and she painted this scene of this group of Savannah kids here. This is a more recent work that came to the museum. This was the gift of an Atlanta area collector. And this is another image of Augusta Olshig. So Olshig was white, but she was really fascinated by African-American culture in Savannah and the life of within those communities. And so she created a lot of images like these, just showing people living their lives, hanging out, playing baseball in the street as folks look on. But beautiful form to her painting as well. If you look here at these figures and then the wheel of this vehicle here, it creates this beautiful circle. And there's a great sort of poetry to the images that she creates as well. And of course, I love these little signs that you see here in the background, just these tiny little snippets of everyday life in Savannah at the time. So again, we see that many of the artists working in Savannah in the early to mid 20th century were really drawn to either that Spanish moss and azaleas, or to the really nitty gritty industrial views, like this work here by Emile Holthauer. Holthauer here shows a train crossing the central of Georgia railroad bridges over the Ogeechee Canal in Savannah. And the portions of that canal 16-mile stretch survive today, including the section in Savannah near the river that's shown here in this painting. Holthauer was originally from Germany and spent time in New York studying under Robert Henry, the famed Ashcan school painter, and then moved to Georgia in 1942, teaching at Wesleyan College in Macon. So he spent time as a visiting instructor at the Telfair Academy, and while he was here, made numerous paintings like this. And then here we've got William Halsey, who was another of those artists who was more associated with Charleston, but spent time over here in Savannah and then completed some work here. So here he's putting a modernist spin on that iconic imagery of the live oak trees and this tree-lined street that we see here. Halsey had the opportunity to study at the museum school in Boston, and was able to serve as an assistant instructor there. He later got a fellowship in 1939 to study abroad in Mexico, and then relocated in 1942 to Savannah, where he served as the director of the art school here, in conjunction with the Savannah Art Club. So this is another one of those rare works that was purchased during the artist's lifetime. This was the Purchase Prize winner in the 1943 Association of Georgia Artists exhibition. So that was one of the very few ways that we did acquire contemporary Georgia artists at the time the work was made, through these exhibitions where the top prize winner got this purchase prize and the work was purchased for the museum collection. And so I want to end with this work here. That's one of our most recent acquisitions of an early 20th century Savannah scene. This had been on view, but because it's a work on paper, it had to come down to rest for a while to protect it from light damage. But this is a work by Philip Hampton, who is known for his really important work in the early years of establishing the art department at Savannah State University. So he served as a professor in the art department at what is now Savannah State from 1952 to 1969, and went on to enjoy a really noteworthy career as an artist, as an educator, as an organizer, and an advocate for his fellow African-American artists at a time when there weren't as many opportunities for artists of color to exhibit in American museums. So he was a talented artist in his own right, but also important to the field as well. And he's one whose story is really under-recognized, and we're in the early stages of looking at putting together an exhibition of his work to bring to Savannah, which would be fantastic. So, I want to end by bringing the conversation up to the present day to underscore that while these works were made in the early 20th century, we today retain some of the original attributes that the museum had when these works were created, which was this commitment to bringing world-class art to Savannah, but also recognizing that we have this really important role in the cultural fabric of the area. And so we're uniquely positioned to tell the story of the history of art made in Savannah, as well as bringing the best of the outside world to our fair city. So, we will continue to research this story and to present this story in temporary exhibitions and in our permanent collection galleries at the Telfair Academy, where we're really proud to be able to, now that we've actually started focusing on collecting works from this era that were made in Savannah, that we've been able to tell this story authentically and with a great deal of depth to our holdings to be able to illustrate it. So that's something that we're really proud to be able to do, and an area where we hope to continue to grow. We today support the work of local Savannah artists through a couple of initiatives. We have the Art 912 initiative, which features exhibitions and juried opportunities for local Savannah artists to exhibit their work at the museum in our Art 912 lounge or in the windows on our Barnard Street side of the Jepson Center. And that's been a really wonderful program for us to better engage with local artists and to present their work to the community. And that's work that we're proud to continue to do. So with that, I will stop my screen share, and I'm happy to field any questions that anybody might have as we wrap up. And if there are no questions, that's fine too.
Well, while we wait for any questions, I did want to thank you very much for coming to talk to us. I'm glad we caught you before you left town.
Me too. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, well, it looks like I covered everything. We have no questions. I have told the whole complete story of art in Savannah in the early 20th century. I just, there's much, much more to this story than I can possibly tell. And because I'm presenting it through the narrow lens of what we contain in Telfair's collection, there are, many artists that we have not collected yet, but we hope to.
Well, thank you again, Courtney, and thank you, Catherine, for being here today. We
Pleasure.
are all very much, oh, wait a minute, hang on. We have a question from Ann Finn.
Can you tell us when we can visit Telfair? Well, that's a great question. We are open to the public. We closed for a few months during the early part of the pandemic, but we reopened in June. We are currently open every day except for Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So you can visit us Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and we're open from 10 to 5 every day. And then always museum members get in free, unlimited access to all 3 of our sites. The Jepson Center and Telfair Academy, you walk up to visit at any time during our opening hours. The Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters site operates on timed tours. They're self-guided tours on your phone. So you have to secure a time slot in advance because we need to spread people out for social distancing. But our other 2 buildings are great places to social distance, lots of room.
Mhm.
All right. Well, we are greatly looking forward to the time when we don't have to social distance and we can maybe take some group trips down there. And either way, I need to get down to visit again. It's been
You absolutely do.
Yeah, it's been a little while, and it's just such a wonderful group of museums. I do highly encourage everyone to go if you have not already been. Well, thank you again. Good luck in
Thank
your
you.
adventure. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Nicole.
much. Have a great day, everybody.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it. Bye.
Bye now.